All right, we've all seen on social media, in a Facebook group, or we've sent a text message asking, how old do you think this deer is? Although it might be one of the most asked questions from deer hunters, can we all agree that precisely aging deer from a single trail camera picture is impossible? But what can we gather and learn when looking at data to age deer? My name is Jake Hofer. Some of my earliest memories as a child is growing up on a small deer farm in central Illinois. Here at Exodus, I personally look at probably over 10,000 photos and videos of deer every single year. And often I am left scratching my head trying to age deer from trail cameras, photos, and videos. Thankfully for folks like you and me, there are piles of resources out there that provide in-depth instructions and practice on aging bucks. And in this video here is to simply help everyone improve their skills of determining if a buck is mature or not. Now, mature might mean something different to everyone here watching this video. For the purpose of this video, we'll say 3 or 4 years old. So let's get right into it and talk about some visual cues when looking at deer. And this is starting off with immature bucks. So immature bucks we'll call 1.5 and 2.5 year old deer often look like, here's an example, have super long legs and they have long noses. They have like bug eyes that poke out. Here's a great example of a deer that I would say has bug eyes. That's like, they're not sunken in yet. They haven't built up the fat deposits around their eye yet. And they, obviously you can check at their antlers. That's a great way to determine if a deer is kind of mature or not. You can kind of look at the pedicle bases, look at the mass. And although none of these are hard and fast rules, as you kind of build the case essentially to age a deer, it's a great way to get a good idea. Now for mature bucks, it's much easier. Here's some examples of just, I call kind of grizzled old deer, and every deer on here I've had multiple years of history with. This deer went MIA, assumed him to be at least 7.5 or 8.5 years old based off of pictures that we had from him when he was either 3 or 4 years old. And you can just see how large his body is. He's got a ton of mass here and, just a mature deer, plain and simple. This deer is a great example of the one with kind of sunken eyes. You can kind of see here in this video, he just looks a little run down in some sense, but just kind of sunken eyes is the best way I can say it here. This is just a mature Midwest whitetail buck cruising in the middle of the rut. This was on November 12th in 2018. I don't know what happened to this deer, but regardless, when I got this video, gorgeous deer just cruising. Here's an example of a deer that is a bona fide mature animal. And so a lot of these are actually, this was the first year I hunted this farm. I had no clue how old this deer was. I would anticipate 5+ just based off the size of his body and what he looks like here. And then actually here he is the following year in 2018, right around that scrape week time frame actually that we always talk about, and lost permission to this farm, but regardless, just an example of a mature buck. But the interesting thing is, there's all these different rules of notion of like, back sway and all these different things. And we'll be talking about that here in a little bit when we talk about some of the deer that I've shot and, sent in for Cementum annuli in the past. So some other things to consider when looking at deer, it's important to note the time of year as well. So, here's an example of a buck. October 31st, 2021. This is this year. I'm actually hunting this deer right now. That's why his antlers are blurred out. I would anticipate this deer to probably be 4 years old. Once again, I don't have any previous history of this deer that I can nail down for sure. There's a couple deer that maybe is him, but I could be very, very easily just decepted here. And then here's that same deer now. And this photo was actually from yesterday. So you can see how much weight he has lost and mass he's lost in his body. And if you would have looked at this, you'd say he's probably a 3-year-old. In this photo, I would disagree. And if you saw his antlers, you'd probably agree as well in terms of the mass, some characteristic like stickers and some other things. So that's something to strongly consider as well. And at the end of the day, as we kind of discussed, I would say this deer is probably 4 years old, and that's what I would determine mature on this farm. Another thing to really consider is with video and photos of trail cameras, looking at the mannerisms of the deer is a great way to kind of get an idea if what the age of the deer is. And also those videos kind of help show you a better idea of what that deer looks like on a longer scope, because a single photo can be very deceiving. It might make the deer look way bigger or way smaller, and I've seen both ends of the spectrum where had pictures of a deer, would have guessed it scored X, and then it ends up scoring X plus or X minus from what I thought. So that's one thing to consider, that these photos can be very deceiving, and even looking at them on the hoof can be deceiving at times depending on what they're doing and the encounter of what it is. But regardless, those are things you have to consider. What are the behaviors of this deer? Are they acting kind of silly and are in the daylight all the time in the wide open? Probably a more immature buck, depending on what part of the country you're at and what your deer neighborhood is. But those are things to all really consider. And, once again, this is not exact. There's no precise way to do it. The only way to do it is if you have multiple years of history. And one thing that I firmly believe is I think most people, on average, block together ages of deer in very simple buckets. That deer's a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and that's it. There's no deer that are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I think on average, most people underage deer on the lower end of the spectrum, and that's just my opinion based off of seeing deer that are sent in for Cementum annuli, and I've been guilty of it myself, and we'll talk about some of these. Now, if you're fortunate enough to wrap your tag around one of your target bucks, sending their teeth in for Cementum annuli aging is one of the most accurate ways to kind of put your guess to actual fact. And so, in short, Cementum annuli is basically where they split the front and sides of teeth and count the rings on the teeth like rings on a tree. We've actually spoke with Heather, who owns Deer Age and is the head lab tech, and we go in depth and talk about the accuracy and process on a podcast with Trail Cam Radio. You can find it in the description here in this video if you want to listen to that conversation. If this is something you're interested in, I found it very interesting. So let's take a look at a few bucks that I shot and aged with Cementum annuli. So let's start with a buck from 2017, and I'll show you some just initial pictures here. So this is actually the day I shot him, and from a neighbor photo, and I don't see necessarily a huge back sway or a huge belly. Here's this deer on the third, another look at him. Not a ton of strong idea here. And, it has strong mass, solid deer, kind of goofy frame on him. Here's actually pictures of him right before I shot him. I was in a tree right over here on the right side of this camera, and he was actually about to get my ground scent probably anywhere right there. So ended up shooting him. And here is a harvest photo of him, so you can get an idea here. Big red head, strong mass, pretty good beams, and sent this deer in for Cementum annuli. Deer Age is the first deer I ever did that with, and it came back to 7 years old. Now, talking with other folks and not necessarily having a ton of history with this deer, admittedly, kind of anticipated this deer to be, you guessed it, 5 years old. There's nothing outside of those initial buckets of deer aging, and came back 7.5 years old, and I thought, wow, that's really amazing. And since then, I've sent in my teeth for every deer that I've shot. So in 2018, I ended up shooting a kind of solid low 40s 10-point. That was a 4-year-old. And then let's go to 2019. So this is a fun one. This here, what would you anticipate this deer's age? So this was the first year I hunted this farm. Got this video trying to anticipate, okay, what is his age? Once again, has strong neck muscles, clearly mature. But if you had to guess what age he would be in this video, what would you guess? Well, come to find out, I ended up shooting that deer the following year. And in these videos here, he was 9.5 years old. Would you guess that was a 9.5-year-old deer? I sure didn't. I mean, you're looking at the body of the deer. There's really not much you can guess. I mean, to some degree, it almost feels like his body was shrinking at this point. Still carried an impressive rack. And then when things got real strange was the following year when I got a video of him. And here he is in 2019. And I don't know if he had an injury or, that's kind of what I was thinking. He got injured badly, and that's why he lost probably 20 inches. And then I ended up killing this deer and sending his teeth, and came back at 10.5 years old. And the interesting thing there too, that kind of helped solidify the case in my mind was I got a photo of him from someone else when he was in Velvet in 2015. Same exact brow tines, looked like he was probably 4 years old, which put him to be roughly nine years old, and he came back 10 and a half years old. 2020, this is an example on kind of what I was referring to people underaging deer. So based off this body here, pretty fair to guess this is in September, the first year I hunted this farm as well, 3 or 4 year old all day. Initially, I was probably guessing, possibly 3 years old, doesn't necessarily have a ton of mass, brows are kind of dinky, solid frame, just a run-of-the-mill nice 8-pointer is kind of how I would describe this deer. And then here he is after I shot him and sent in his teeth in for aging, and he came back as a 4-year-old. And I had some more pictures of him in the rut, and, in those pictures, I would say he was, built a better case of being a 4-year-old, but regardless, wouldn't have known that otherwise and would have just guessed he was 3 or 4, but it's cool to know exactly afterwards. But once again, like looking at these photos, how are you supposed to quantify the exact age? He was 3 or 4, and then you're able to figure that out after sending in his teeth. This one's kind of a fun one. I haven't sent in his teeth yet. This is the deer I shot from this past year, and the owners of to where this is not my picture from the year before. Once again, I'm going to be really curious to see what this deer ages out at. But same exact frame. Here he is, November. A deer that's probably never going to score much. Has a tiny little burr point for a brow tine. G4 on the left sides was actually broken off, but would not have amounted to much in my opinion. And then here's the harvest photo to get a better look at him. And I'm going to guess this deer to probably be 4 or 5 years old. But once again, there is no hard way of knowing from looking at it, but you can still get an idea from looking at some of these photos. I mean, here his neck looks pretty dang heavy, and I didn't really necessarily have a ton of great photos of him leading up to when he got shot, but I saw him on the hoof the day before and got a look at him, very closely and assumed he was 4 or 5 years old. Here's some other fun deer that I would just kind of put in that 3 to 4 year old bucket. Looking at his antlers, I'd probably guess 3 years old, but you don't know for sure. I definitely wouldn't say he's a 2-year-old. Based off his body, he's got his brisket kind of shaking there. And once again, this is November 6th, so they're starting to lose a little bit of body mass. I'd probably pin him as a 3-year-old, but would not have been surprised if he was 4. No clue what happened to that deer. Here's the fun one that I don't know what happened to this deer. Those are my sticks right there. I set up late season, found this deer earlier in the year, and really was never on him until late season. And I hunted this spot the evening before, and I should have been, this is the middle of the day in late season. So, but regardless, kind of looking at his eyes here, not necessarily sunken in. Kind of feels like he has a long nose here. Beautiful frame on this deer. Here he is knowing something isn't right as I just put this camera up. Didn't go through the procedures that we always talk about of elevating them and everything else. And then he just gets bugged out. There he goes. But if you had to guess, is this just an absolute stud 3-year-old? Very well could be. But once again, it's pretty fair to guess he's not 2. And so that's just kind of these things. Like the more photos and videos you look at, the better idea you have. And that's the beauty of this. And one thing to really consider, it's kind of like people. You can guess roughly what is the age of that person. You can guess, I'd guess them to be in their late 20s. Or their early 30s. But there's no clear way to say for sure without them showing them your driver's license or something along those lines, because things vary from your health, your work environment, your stress levels, your genetics, just like those same buckets that go into a deer. Some people go bald in their 20s, and some people have hair until the day of they die. And anymore, some people get gray hair in their 40s, and some of them get them in their 50s. So it's like, same exact idea. You can get a strong idea. You can kind of generalize it, but in order to specifically age something, you have to have multiple years of history starting back from 2.5, 1.5, or even 3.5 years old, which becomes tricky, but at least you have a baseline metric of keeping track. And that's where we talk about organizing photos on a year-to-year basis, so you can go back and look and try to deduct some of these things that we talked about here today, looking at their body mannerisms to basically build a case of understanding what is the rough idea age of this deer. And that's what it is at the end of the day, a rough idea. So we hope you guys enjoyed it. This is kind of a fun thing here. I'm sure there's a lot of varying opinions. There's so much information on this. There's so many people with opinions. And this was just mine. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And until next time, see you.